Hey everybody, I'm Nick Layton.
And I'm Leah Bottima.
And we're the hosts of Were You Raised by Wolves?
Each week we try to make the world a kinder, nicer place.
Well, that's the idea, at least.
I mean, we try.
Have you ever wondered what to do if you're ghosted?
Or what to do when a friend asks you to borrow money?
Or the proper way to eat Cheetos?
You know, the big questions.
So please find Were You Raised by Wolves wherever you listen.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Good morning, everybody. This is Amuse News. I am RJ, your host. We're live once again for you here. It is Thursday. This is my third day in a row bringing you some news and interviews. I'm excited about our guest today, one of the OGs of HRN once again, and one of the people who still records at Roberta's in Bushwick as often as he can. And I hear that he's one of the most popular guys in New York, although I haven't yet gone around New York with him. But Jimmy Carbone is going to join us in just a minute. He's the host of Beer Sessions Radio, one of the longest running shows on HRN. And this is, of course, Amuse News, your destination for food news and conversation. And looking forward to talking to Jimmy in just a minute. As usual, first I want to talk a little bit about stuff I'm listening to, stuff I'm reading, stuff I'm seeing out there in the food world. The first thing, well, and as I usually say, please send us recommendations and thoughts about things you think we should be talking about. Okay, so first I want to talk about a New York Times piece that I saw yesterday that the title is "A Year on Ozempic Taught Me We're Thinking About Obesity All Wrong." It's really interesting. There's so much conversation out there about these drugs and, the ability for people to kind of change their lives through these drugs. And one of the cool things about this is that the whole idea of these drugs is to make you feel more full. And what this piece talks about in detail is some research and some kind of history behind the reason that we've gained weight in a pace unprecedented in human history is that our diets changed in a way that have undermined our ability to feel sated. So they talk a little bit about some of these experiments and other things that have happened in the past, showing that basically when people eat whole food, just meat and vegetables and things that are not processed, you feel full more easily. And, ultra processed food just makes you feel less full. So you eat more. And one of the main questions in the piece that the author asks is, why do we turn our anger inward and not outward at the cause of the crisis? And by extension, why do we seek to shame people taking Ozempic, but not those who take drugs to lower their blood pressure? And another kind of like conclusion of the piece is that you're not a sinner for gaining weight and being one of these people who takes Ozempic. You're a typical product of a dysfunctional environment that makes it very hard to feel full. And if you're angry about these drugs, remember the competition isn't between you and your neighbor who's on a weight loss drug. It's between you and the food industry that's constantly designing new ways to undermine your ability to feel full. I thought that was really interesting and a really thought-provoking piece. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and that's from the New York Times. Another piece from the Times, there's a place in Queens that is growing mushrooms from food waste. It's a 3,500 square foot room deep in an industrial building across from an auto junkyard in Queens. So it's an indoor farm that grows mushrooms for restaurants in Manhattan, grown in food waste collected from those restaurants. It's really cool. Afterlife Ag is the company that does it. So it picks up restaurant waste, not the scraps that customers leave on their plates, but discards from the chefs. So they take this kind of discards and waste and return with mushrooms. So they basically take this to their facility. They create a substrate in which they grow mushrooms, sometimes with wood chips or shavings from sawmills, sometimes with sawdust from purveyors that smoke fish, sometimes with hemp from hemp farms. And they grow mushrooms and they take them back to these restaurants in New York that they then use them for their food, which I think is a really cool way to think about food waste and just a really cool idea. A podcast episode that I want to mention real quick is that I was listening to Food with Mark Bittman. Mark Bittman is going to be a guest on this show coming up. They interview Chantha Nguyen, who's an author and cook, who talks about what she remembers fleeing her home in Cambodia at the age of 9, and kind of the genocide that happened there, and how the memory of her mother's cooking saved her life, and how and why she decided to reclaim her family's recipes. It's a really cool, really inspiring conversation that you should check out. Again, links in the show notes. Last thing, another episode of a podcast I listened to from the food chain called Eat With Your Hands. It's a really interesting episode from this BBC podcast. They talk about different food cultures around the world that eat using their hands, and most of us use our hands some of the time, of course, like chicken wings and burgers and lots of other stuff. But we hear stories in this podcast from around the world, including Kenya, where they talk about ugali, which is traditionally eaten with your hands, but people are increasingly using knife and fork, spoon to eat the dish. And they also talk about whether food may be more enjoyable and even tastes better when eaten by hand. I mentioned that I went to lunch at a place in New York yesterday, One Bite Omakase, which was great. But I was encouraged by the sushi chef to eat each piece with my hands. And I think it did make me probably pay a little bit more attention, probably take a little bit more time, and probably was a little bit more focused on the food itself. So I thought that was really cool, and good idea to kind of explore that. Okay, so now we're going to bring on our guest, Jimmy Carbone, one of the OGs of Heritage Radio Network. Hey, Jimmy.
Hey, RJ. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, thank you for being willing. You were one of the first people I met when I took this job, and you're one of the most familiar faces at Roberta's, and always out there promoting what we're doing here at HR. And so I appreciate you, and I appreciate what you do.
Well, thanks. And I really liked your intro. There's a few talking points I'll have from that, including I was in Copenhagen last fall doing a few shows on the road, and I was with a brewer named Grohl. It's bread and beer Earl. And the secret of his operation is he's into sustainability as an engineer. And they share a facility with a mushroom growing operation. So it turns out that spent grain, which it's your main byproduct of making beer, is the perfect food for cultivated mushrooms. So that was one of the cool episodes that I did on Beer Sessions Radio recently.
That's really cool. Don't you think that should be doesn't it seem so obvious, but maybe that's how these kind of innovations are?
Well, I think when you mentioned ultra processed foods, versus like a more traditional food chain, it's just the level of processing, and if you're starting with quality ingredients, then that food waste is still quality. I mean, years ago when I was in Amsterdam, there's a well-known brewery called the Egg Brewery, and they were thrilled to tell us that their spent grain goes across the harbor to a sheep farm, and then they serve that sheep farm's camembert, with
cool.
your plate. So the whole circuit, if you're making quality food, and that's what I do a lot on the show. We try to find people that are doing neat things, but in the food and drink realm, and usually it comes down to, especially more and more, who's working with quality ingredients.
Yeah, I appreciate that about the show. And I should say Beer Sessions Radio is you're 700 episodes in and still broadcasting from Roberta's as often as you can, which is great. Tell us, how did the show come together? Because I know you have a background in food, and what was your original idea in launching the show?
Well, a lot of things that I do I would say kind of come from the community I'm involved in. So I was interested in food and drink at an early age. You talk about food memories. When I went to college in New York City, and on my first day, I realized that I'd never been outside of my family's food system, whether it was my grandmother's, my aunts, or my mother and father. And I was stuck in the cafeteria or uptown Manhattan. My wallet could afford $1.25 pizzas. It ended me. I left school a couple of times and traveled, and all I wanted was to find simple, affordable lunch or food by hand, as you were saying, just something simple. And next thing I knew, I was working in a restaurant in Manhattan. Suddenly I was the wine buyer, and I had a quick education. And about 30 years ago, I opened a small restaurant in the East Village. And the story of that is that, I saw the reason I ended up doing the radio show is that I saw in the 1990s, the restaurant world was very different. It was before Food Network. You didn't have as much professionalism as you do now. And there was also a lot of competition. There really weren't. I always felt that my neighbor who had a bar on one side and the neighbor on the other with a restaurant, they were all cutthroat and they were all going after me. And so I never really had a lot of, most of my friends were winemakers or distributors or salespeople that served me and customers, but I never really got to know other restaurateurs. And what led me to doing the radio shows when I became a dad in 2002, the community of play groups and preschools and PTAs, I got more and more involved in working on community events and fundraisers. So that ended up leading me to working with some beer bar owners in the late aughts, and we created a group of beer bar owners. And when Heritage Radio Network started, at that time, HRN was the premier, maybe one of the first online radio shows, networks, and top editors. So at the time, Edible Brooklyn was the hottest magazine. Rachel Wharton was the assistant editor. She had a show. Josh Ozersky was the hottest blog, was Grub Street for New York Magazine. Josh Ozersky, rest in peace. He had a show on that. And so I got a chance. I met the founder, and I went on a couple of the shows, and I had a chance to start a beer show. And the original idea was bring together the beer bar owners, because our community, we had a small knit community of indie beer bar owners who cared about craft beer, whether it was some imported traditions from Germany and Belgium, or some of the new American craft beers. We were all on the same page. So I thought we would do the show. I in the beginning, I always had another beer bar owner as a co-host, because by that time I had my restaurant. I'd morphed it into more of a beer bar restaurant, and we started bringing in just kind of organically. One guest would come on, and suddenly that guest would bring in a sales rep, and next thing you know, we were talking to the owners of breweries like Bell's or Sierra Nevada and Brooklyn Brewery. But mostly we always focus on the New York City community and bringing in guests and bartenders and sales reps. And the reason it was thriving at Roberta's Pizza, and it still does, is it's the ultimate, networking opportunity. When you're online, it's you and me talking, and that's a great experience. But when we're at Roberta's, there's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of us, and if someone has a guest, they can join in, and we have a drink at the bar before we go on air.
Yeah.
While we're on air, someone will have brought at least a couple of drinks to try. We'll come out afterwards, and many of us will sit and eat and drink together at Roberta's, and it becomes a whole experience. So it became a destination happening, and it still does when we do it. And it's probably why I did it so long. At the time, I had been on, Martha Stewart used to have a hot food radio show. And to record that, you went to a large office building in Midtown. And, it was a major network. So you'd check in with a receptionist, wait in the holding area. You'd get on for about 10 minutes. You usually had a pretty scripted theme. It might have been something like, come in with a recipe that's either, there's one that's fast and one that's fancy. And I was always like, well, my dish is both. and I would say, well, it's fancy because I slow cook this pork loin, and it's fast because I'm going to slice it and serve it with tuna sauce the next day. But so that was my experience with radio. And when I started, I thought, I'll do the Heritage Radio Network show, and then I'll end up having a show on Martha Stewart Radio. And I really had no clue what I was doing, but a very short time, you realize that the community of Heritage Radio Network, the community of Doing Ear Sessions Radio, I mean, now I've had over 1,000 guests. And when I travel, so when I went to Copenhagen last fall, and I reached out to just a couple people that I knew through the radio show. And suddenly I had a whole week of activities, dinner at someone's home, visit to a craft butcher, visit to the brewer who's partnering with the mushroom cultivator, a visit to a cool restaurant. My favorite show is with the guy. He's a hot dog vendor, and in Copenhagen you get it's one of those. The way the Danish society is, it seems like it finds jobs for everyone. So you're going to have a job, and so if you are disabled, you're eligible to get a hot dog vending permit. So this chef, he's now I call him, his name John's Hot Dog Deli. I can never remember his other name, but he became famous with his hot dog stand in central Copenhagen. He got to know one of the more famous brewery owners, McKellar, and next thing you know, he was the only hot dog vendor at McKellar's annual beer fest. And oh, by the way, he also makes hot sauces. So we got to hang out with him in his little workshop while they were bottling hot sauce, and that's part of the whole community. And so I can't imagine not doing it. And when we came back this, last year when you started, RJ, it was kind of a big push. I feel like a few of us said, well, you know what, Roberta's has been our home. They really want people in the studio. I know that you right away got tuned into, what the shows were doing. So I really made a push. I think I've been on track now since then I'm in the studio about twice a month now, which means for me, because I've got a gypsy life, I'm more of a event producer now. Yeah. I try to get into the city twice a month, and then I book my whole day around doing the show and being at Roberta's. So that's a little bit of my intro.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I appreciate that. And I need to join an episode. I haven't joined an episode yet. I've been in there while you're recording, and I've hung out after. But I love beer. I love talking beer. So someday we'll do that. Yeah, and we talk about themes and things. The show also kind of goes where the industry is. So like my friend Carlo DeVito is writing a book about the history of New York beer, and it's going to come out in a year or two. It's going to be a 500-page book. And it's every anecdote from the first, Dutch settlers up until the beginning of craft beer. So he used our show, it started in 2010. So 2010 to 2014, that was really the early days of the new New York State and New York City brewery scene. And at the time, it was through the eyes of the beer bar owners like myself, which were at the time until 2014, like even Brooklyn Brewery, they couldn't have a tap room. You used to have to go to Brooklyn Brewery, buy a token, and the token gave you a certain size glass of beer. Yeah, I remember that. It's crazy,
and it didn't seem that crazy then, but yeah. Also the beer bars, we were the stars. All the brewers came to us. They would do their launch events with us, and I remember, it was just ending in 2014 when the amazing New York State Craft Beverage Act went through, and some of the last launches we had, other half, they did their Manhattan launch at my old pub, Jimmy's Number 43 in Finback, and it was a special time. But I think we really captured it those first 4 years. But then as things change, at some point, breweries took on their own identity. They became the place that hosted their own festivals and their own, launches and things. I just like a good restaurant pub owner, I have other interests. So from doing the show, I covered some of the first cider weeks that were in New York, and I've got some great interviews with a lot of pioneers. People doing good things. It's a great place, for them to come on and talk. And there was one summer of 2015. It was a really cool, one of the first, and it's no longer there, cider bars in Manhattan called Wassail, and it was on the Lower East Side. And for about 3 to 6 months, they had a different national figure in cider flying into New York just to do a tasting at their restaurant bar. And one of the cider enthusiasts says, would you just start doing cider sessions episodes? And I talked with the HRN, and they set me up with a portable recorder, and we started doing the shows at my pub, Jimmy's Number 43. And, that's just one or more of the amazing experiences I've had, where suddenly I met, probably about 20 of some of the top cider makers who've been around for a while in America. And that's it. The fun keeps going. Just yesterday, I was up in New Hampshire, Northwoods. It's kind of the lake country. Technically, their address is a U.S. highway. There's not really a street or anything, but it's kind of halfway from here in northern Mass to Portland, where I'm going to be this weekend. And the connection was craft malt. Going back to quality ingredients. And as craft beer grew, for me there might have been fewer interesting stories just about the new breweries, and but then the actual people making good beer, everything really kept growing. So, craft malt depends on regional malt, depends on agriculture and grain. And my friends at the Union Square Green Market, the Grow NYC, had their own regional grains initiative going back to 2008 and 2009. And I got to be part of that and covered that often. And that's a neat thing to talk about, because it also felt like HRN was right in the middle of that, as well as cider. There are other, we'd have, when Cider Week came, I would do a Cider Week episode, as well as several other shows on the network, because it was such an important thing, connecting agriculture and food and drink. And when the regional grains movement started, the regular mission was, well, there's a green market system in New York City, and they're very strict. They have inspections. Any farmer there has to grow what they sell. So you couldn't become a middle person and source chickens from 10 other farms in your area. The idea is that they wanted to encourage people growing and selling their own product, and they've been very successful. But the one hole, the grandfather clause, were local bakers. There were bakers in, let's say, Jersey City, who'd been in the market for 20 years, and they were selling, say, focaccias and breads, but they were buying supermarket flour. And there was a discussion about it for a long time, about how that would get treated to make it fair, and also to start including farms. So that movement, the regional grains movement, worked closely with Cornell Cooperative, and that's a huge part of ag in New York State. And they realized, well, there's a problem, because first the farmers have to grow grain. Then you need, the mills, and it's the same as craft beer. You're growing barley. You need to know which barleys can grow, because New York was a great wheat and barley. It was a great barley state, just like it was a hop state. And then by the 20th century, most of that moved out to, the Pacific Northwest, and other, larger parts where there were flat land and you could do larger agriculture. But just to bring that back, you think what it took, and it happened quite fast. New York State really rallied, and the green market was a big part of that push. So let's say they set a target; it might have been 20% to 50%. If you want to sell bread at Union Square Green Market, you had to use 50%, flour that was local to you. But that whole process took a long time. And there's right now the most amazing bakery in New York City is called She Wolf, and it's owned by a small restaurant group that includes Diner and Marlowe and Sons in Williamsburg. You can go to a couple of the Grow NYC Green Markets on select days and buy the bread. But that also translated into whiskey. There's an Empire Rye project that we covered. That when you do all the grains, I think there's certain levels of quality, like with malt, types of grain and the malt quality. Beer is actually a stricter requirement, because you're actually, the whole process depends on that grain. And you can have a wider variation of the grain quality for distilling, because it's just the process of distilling. There's room for variation in there, and I'm not the expert, but I do know that you'll see that it's a lot easier to have a showcase New York State grain spirit than it is for beer. And even though there's some breweries that are really focusing on it. So Empire Rye was the first big project, and we covered that in 2017. We had a really great show with grains people and distillers, and it was an important week. It was in the New York Times. And the Empire Rye project, it started with 5 distilleries. They had to make a whiskey with 50% New York State rye, and then at that time they were aging it 3 years. And again, we using Heritage Radio Network as a time capsule. I still can't believe all the great things that I've gotten to cover. So, yeah, those are just some of the moments and some of the intro. Yeah.
Thank you for all that. I have a question about, I love beer, and I love socially, like having beers with friends and new people and having conversations. I've seen people go into the studio with a cooler, presumably full of beer. How do you keep the conversations at least somewhat focused while people are, trying many different beers and probably at some point, starting to lose their focus on the topic at hand? How have you handled that as the kind of herder and moderator of the group?
Well, what with a live show with multiple guests, the key is having always more guests. So that one bottle of beer goes pretty. It gets spread around.
Yeah.
I try to do it more like a moderated, dinner party conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So you try to find who's actually hot. I usually start. That's why I like the long form. I'm not a soundbite guy, although we probably have thousands of sound bites. It's live conversation, so you kind of see who's hot that day. There's usually someone. A lot of times, the more experienced person may have the same shtick, but then I'll always encourage them to bring in a new sales rep, and usually that sales rep has a fresh take on it. And then we'll usually ask them, how they got into it. I'm always interested in, especially in these quirky fields, and they are quirky, food and beverage jobs. There's a lot of people that went to a good college. They might have been in a band or an arts background. Some of them were engineers. I like to know those stories. So there's usually something interesting to talk about. So that doesn't answer your question, but we don't get plastered.
But I also like the idea of rotating people.
Yeah, professional drinkers too. So.
Yeah. Well, it's really cool, and congrats. I have to ask you, I asked Darren this yesterday about Snacky Tunes, but have you had any serious disasters while recording? Because I've had a bunch, with guests who don't show up or unprepared, or something weird happens with the recording, or And Roberta's, you're in a fishbowl because people are watching you. And I don't know. I'm just wondering, are there any stories that come to mind about things that happened that you were like, oh no?
At Roberta's, nothing can go wrong. I used to always plan to have more guests than fewer for that reason. Yeah. I also believe in this. I read about it years ago. They call it the hometown newspaper effect. That you put every kid's picture in the newspaper, every kid's name for the honor roll in the newspaper, and that's how you get an audience. So initially I thought, well, the more people I have on the show, the more chance that other people will listen. But it also goes the same for conversation. There's we just had we got a couple last minute calls when people know I'm doing the show, and suddenly, there's a top brewer from Spain. He happens to be in New York. And he joins in. And then, 5 minutes later, another expert says, there's this amazing woman who's from Argentina who's the talk of the town. And suddenly I had a show with 8 people, and those 2 were probably had the most interesting things to say. So I don't have any disasters at Roberta's. The real disasters, there was probably the night of, I don't know if I missed a Hurricane Sandy. When there's been disasters in New York City, if the studio was shut down, which used to be very rare, I might get stuck with one guest. My idea of a disaster was being stuck with one guest. So I think that I only had one guest in the first 12 or 13 years. For me, being online was quite frightening for me, doing one-on-ones. And I don't usually talk that much. So thanks for letting me talk.
Yeah,
but
of course.
Being online for me was really hard, but I got a lot of practice during the pandemic. And what was neat about that is that I was forced to do one-on-ones and go a little deeper, as well as being able to talk to people in the comfort of their own office. And I probably got a whole nother type of show from doing online. And in the same way now, the only disasters I've had have been my own fault. When I've been, I get to use this. Started when I was doing some cider shows in 2015. I've had the same handheld device, which enables me to go almost anywhere. Like yesterday, I was up in New Hampshire at a brewery, and this weekend I'll be in Portland, Maine. I'll probably record a show there as well. But there was one time that I had set up a really cool show at Breeze Brewing in Brooklyn, and it
great
had
spot.
a whole bunch of very cool guests, and I realized that I had not recorded it.
Oh man!
I pressed, there's one button. There's two buttons. I only pressed it once. It was back when
I know the feeling.
Usually it had something help me do it. So, you get it.
Yeah.
And what was so cool is that with the experience of us all being there, it was a special event at Threes. There were 6 or 8 of us in the room. We were all trying a lot of beers. And a couple weeks later, when the show would have come out, because there wasn't a PR person on top of this, it was just us. Not one person ever really asked me about it because the experience of sitting there with the microphone, people thought it was great.
Yeah. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Well, I think I know you have travel. You're on your way up to Maine and Portland. Man, what an amazing beer city that is. It's going to create so much great stuff there. What are you looking forward to this year in terms of the show? And then I'll let you go.
Well, already in New York City, because the New York State Craft Beverage Act was 2014. Well, now it's 2024, and there's quite a few 10-year anniversaries coming up of breweries. We did a really great show last month with Transmitter, which has really become probably one of the best breweries in New York State. And they're in the first week. It's coming up. I think May 31st. They're hosting a 10-year anniversary at their brewery. But doing that show was really great. And again, we brought together a beer buyer from a retail operation, as well as a couple other luminaries to talk with them. So that's probably, I would keep an eye out for 10-year anniversaries. Finback's going to have one, I'm sure. Other half is probably looking at 10 years also. So that's really cool. That's going to be big news in New York City.
Keep me posted on the other half one, will you? I love their beer so much. I gotta check it out.
Well, that's a show we'll do. And come on, we'll do a show because it's overdue. We'll do a show about the family tree of IPAs in New York City and New York area, because there's a couple. There's a couple. There was a bar. There's still a bar called Tourist, but when its original ownership and when it opened, it really gathered a number of really entrepreneurial young people, and a few of them have gone on to open their own breweries, and they're all kind of doing a really good IPAs. Root and Branch is one. Yeah, they work at Tourist, and other half is in this. There's a lot of families of beer. You see some of the articles about chef families where who worked under which chef, and there's usually some of the most interesting chefs spawn hundreds of restaurants.
Wow,
there's a few of that in beer. That could be cool. We'll do.
I'd love to learn more about that.
IPA show, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate it. I just inserted myself in the beer.
We'll do it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I might say midsummer. How about that?
That sounds awesome. And thank you, Jimmy, for taking the time and for all your awesome work and the content you're creating. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for letting me talk, RJ.
Yeah,
have a great day.
Of course. And everyone else, Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll talk to y'all soon. See you next week.
All right. See ya.
Hey, it's Francis Lamb, host of The Splendid Table. Every week on our show, we talk about food and cooking and the meanings of food and cooking. We talk with the most interesting people in food about their techniques, their culture, and everything in between. Whether it's about how fried chicken took over the world or how Instagram changes the way people are actually eating. It's a food show where everyone is welcome. Come join us. You can listen to The Splendid Table wherever you get your podcasts.